Hello to the folks who are just joining us. You are in the right place for the Clean Water webinar. We're going to get things kicked off here in just a couple minutes. If you're already tuned in, feel free to throw a little hello in the chat and maybe say where you're tuning in from. It's a beautiful day in St. Louis, Missouri. I hope everyone else is having a nice day of some nice weather. Okay, I am sure we'll have some more folks trickling in, but just in the interest of time, we can go ahead and get started. Before I turn it over to our illustrious speakers, I will give a little bit of housekeeping info. So this presentation is being recorded. We'll share the recording after the fact. So if you miss anything or if you just want to revisit anything, keep an eye on your email. Also, I think most of us are familiar with the chat function. If you haven't already said hello or shared where you're tuning in from, feel free to drop that there. If you have questions throughout the talk, we plan to answer those questions at the end, and we should have plenty of time to get to those. But it's easiest for us to keep track of questions if you throw those in the Q&A feature. So there's a Q&A button. It looks like a little question speech bubble down at the bottom of your screen, most likely. And that's a great place to throw any questions you have while Jared and Kate are speaking, and we will address those at the end. So I'm going to drop into the background now, but I'll be on here if you have any questions or issues. But I'm going to start by turning it over to Jared, who's here, of course, from the Izaak Walton National Headquarters. So take it away, Jared.
Thanks, Heather. I am not at the headquarters. I am in Herndon, Virginia, where it is also a beautiful day. Power still went out anyway. So let me get my screen going. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about protecting and conserving and restoring wetlands in a post-Sackett landscape. What are some of the things that organizations like the Izaak Walton League of America is doing? And, as well as our colleague organizations. I saw a couple of folks on from, partner orgs that we work with, daily, basically. So I'll run through this pretty quick. We're going to do a quick review of Sackett just because, every comic book is somebody's first. And then we'll jump into some of the things that the league and other organizations are working on to sort of protect wetlands as best we can in this kind of new landscape that we're faced with. That part will probably get a little technocratic. I'll do my best to get us through that with as much joy and humor as we can muster, but just a fair warning. So quick review on Sackett v. EPA. I don't know if y'all were on the Clean Water webinar that I did kind of post-Sackett. I don't remember when it was, sometime in 2023. So if you were, some of these slides are going to look familiar. Some of this is going to sound very familiar. But just to quickly go over what happened. So Sackett was decided about a year ago, last May, and it was concerning the Clean Water Act and the Clean Water Act's jurisdiction over wetlands. The Clean Water Act, as you probably know, was passed more than 50 years ago to protect and restore the nation's waters, make them fishable and swimmable and drinkable. In this case, centered on what particular wetlands the Clean Water Act protects and which it does not. What wetlands count as waters of the United States, or WOTUS? And what even is a WOTUS? Very briefly, all you really need to know for this conversation is that a WOTUS is how the Clean Water Act defines its own jurisdiction. So in order for a water body to be under the jurisdiction of the Federal Clean Water Act, it needs to be a water of the United States or a WOTUS. If it is determined not to be a WOTUS, it is not eligible for those federal protections. So what happened is the majority of the court drastically cut protections for wetlands. To kind of cut to the chase there. So Justices Alito, Roberts, Gorsuch, Thomas, and Barrett ruled that wetlands, in order to fall under the protection of the Clean Water Act, must qualify as a water of the United States in their own right. Now, this is important because before, they had been determined that it was determined that they were protected by the Clean Water Act if they were adjacent to a water of the United States. And the court was using the term significant nexus to determine that adjacency. And what this court decided in the Sackett case was that in order to be protected by the act, a wetland needed to be a WOTUS in its own right. And for that to be true, in order for it to be adjacent to a WOTUS and therefore be a WOTUS in its own right, it had to have a continuous surface connection to a water body like a perennial stream, lake, or ocean, such that there is no clear demarcation between the two. So basically, it's got to be touching, and it's got to be touching all of the time in order for a wetland to be considered a WOTUS. As you can see in this photo right here, you can kind of see wetland on one side next to a river, but the ordinary high water mark, the bank of the river basically separates those two. So under the new Sackett ruling, that wetland there that you see in the upper right corner would not be protected as a water of the United States. So then in August, the EPA had to issue a conforming rule that took into account what the Supreme Court had said, and that was issued this past August. And it determines adjacency. Basically, they didn't have much choice here. They had to follow what the court had said. So it defines adjacent as having a continuous surface connection. And it requires that intrastate lakes, ponds, and streams be connected to traditional navigable waters. Again, this goes back to needing to demonstrate that continuous surface connection. So if a stream or a wetland or a pond that doesn't cross the state boundary does not have that continuous surface connection, it would not be considered a water of the United States. And interestingly, this new conforming rule omitted interstate wetlands, so wetlands that cross state boundaries. Since the passage of the Clean Water Act in 1972, they have always been considered jurisdictional under the Clean Water Act because they did cross state lines, and this conforming rule removed them as a standalone basis, and again relies on that continuous surface connection. A good example of a wetland like this is one that you may have heard of, the Okefenokee Swamp. Crosses state lines between Georgia and Florida, but doesn't necessarily have a continuous surface connection to another navigable water or more traditionally defined water of the United States. And so now the entire Okefenokee is now considered not under the federal jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act. So what are the impacts of Sackett? Fundamentally alters the scope and application of the Clean Water Act through all of its sections, through section 401, and how the states are administering parts of this act, through section 404, dredge and fill permits, 402, discharge permits. This affects the entire act just because of the importance of how that act is written and how it relies on pulling those waters of the United States into its jurisdiction. If you alter the definition of those waters, you dramatically alter the applicability of the act itself. And so kind of the on the ground realities here is that up to 63% of wetlands are going to lose federal protections. That's across the country. And this is probably not a group that I have to, mention the importance of wetlands to, but when you lose 63% of your wetlands, of course, you're going to see declines in water quality, loss of flood protections, and degradation of pretty vital fish and wildlife habitat. Without these federal protections, state, tribal, and local entities are going to have to step up to sort of backfill where the Clean Water Act used to protect. And I think we're seeing now, it's been long enough that we're seeing that in some states and on some tribal lands, they are stepping up, but in others they're not. For a lot of states, the Clean Water Act was, the backstop, and they had actually passed regulations or laws saying that state regulations could go no further than what the federal Clean Water Act provided. So once that federal act was weakened, those states then their regulations or protections were automatically weakened as well. Ultimately, Congress is going to have to fix this by amending the Clean Water Act to very purposefully clarify that wetlands and tributary streams, whether they have a continuous surface connection or not, are in fact protected by the Clean Water Act. They're the ultimate arbiter here, but action is incredibly unlikely just given the current political climate. So looking forward, it's easy to despair, but you can't do that. We can't do that, and you can't do that. We have to keep fighting. And so I want to talk a little bit about what the League and a lot of our partners are doing, and then a few steps that you can take that are really helpful for fighting for clean water and wetlands moving forward. So the first thing I'm going to cover is some actions that have broad overarching implications. These concern multiple agencies within the administration. The first is establish a national gain wetlands goal. This is something that every administration since something I should know. Was it George H.W. Bush or George W. Bush? I think it was H.W. Bush. Bush the first affirmed. And so, this means that lost wetland functions, have to be restored through mitigation, creation, or conservation on a case-by-case basis. Implementing no net loss only maintains current wetland status with minimal opportunities for actual gain in wetlands resources. But the fact of the matter is that the first thing that we have to do in a post-Sackett landscape is stop the bleeding. The second kind of broad overarching goal is directing or having the CEQ, which is the President's Council on Environmental Quality, direct NEPA analysis to require mitigation for all losses of aquatic services and functions. If you're unfamiliar with NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, it is the big, broad, overarching piece of legislation and since regulation that sort of covers all federal action. So anytime any federal action is involved, a NEPA analysis has to be done. And so if the Council on Environmental Quality, which has already provided leadership in protecting the nation's wetlands, you may have seen, oh geez, was that last week or the week before? I think it was the week before for Earth Day. You saw the Biden administration announce its vision for freshwater protections, where they want to restore 8 million acres of wetlands and do all sorts of stuff. But one of the things that this CEQ can do is direct this NEPA analysis to require mitigation as part of any federal action that may interfere with wetlands, whereas before Sackett they would have had to get a permit, right? Now that Sackett is the law of the land, that permit is no longer necessary, but CEQ can still regulate NEPA in such a way that mitigation would be required for wetlands losses. A third is request that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service lead an update of the National Wetlands Priority Conservation Plan. That is exactly what it sounds like. The Fish and Wildlife Service has created this wetlands priority conservation plan, but it has not been updated in, I don't remember the exact amount of time, but it's decades. And so, updating that priority conservation plan feels especially important in a post-Sackett landscape. Obviously, enhancing interagency wetland efforts or conservation efforts is kind of a no-brainer here, but in news that I'm sure is shocking to nobody, different aspects of the federal government don't always do a great job talking to each other. And especially when we're talking about something like wetlands that could potentially fall under so many jurisdictions. Department of the Interior, Department of the Army, Department of Agriculture, all sorts of different regulations and jurisdictions, really working to make sure that the left arm knows what the right hand is doing is a priority. And then further invest in on-the-ground capacity and workforce development initiatives to scale wetland and stream conservation efforts. That's a lot of words to really just kind of say that on-the-ground capacity to implement these sorts of restoration projects is a key limiting factor to scaling existing wetland and stream efforts. There's promise here. Some examples are the American Climate Corps, Working Lands Climate Corps, Cooperative Watershed Management Program, and the Healthy Watersheds Consortium grants. These are all great avenues for further investment in the work that's being done to really get as many acres of wetlands and streams conserved and restored as possible. So moving from sort of these broad interagency actions that we're working on, let's focus in on the Department of the Interior a little bit. And the first is increased utilization of LWCF for wetland, stream, water conservation. A little bit of background on the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So Land and Water Conservation Fund takes offshore royalties that are paid, or I'm sorry, royalties from offshore energy development, or oil and gas development specifically. And they go into a fund, the Land and Water Conservation Fund, that the government has set aside. And it's been fully funded and permanently authorized here in the last, when was that? 2020, 2021. Very recently, the act was created in the 1960s, but only in the last 2 or 3 years has it become both permanent and fully funded at $900 million a year. So that's $900 million a year that are going back into projects in all 50 states. Every county in the country has an LWCF funded project in it, at least one. And, one of the things that Interior can do is direct relevant federal agencies to reevaluate LWCF criteria to assess opportunities to increase utilization of those funds for conserving wetlands, streams, and in-stream flows. This is just really about prioritizing money that we're already spending on conservation of wetlands and streams to, again, put those protections in place where we can in a post-Sackett landscape. The next thing that Interior can do is increase funding for Fish and Wildlife Service wetland conservation easements. If you're unfamiliar with this program, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act authorizes the Fish and Wildlife Service to acquire or conserve lands and wetlands through conservation easements for use as waterfowl production areas in the prairie pothole region. So what we can ask is for enhanced, diverse funding to increase the pace and scale of these acquisition of these wetlands conservation easements, and importantly, evaluate opportunities to expand the program beyond migratory birds and beyond the prairie pothole region to try and conserve wetlands, not just in this, what is a very critically important region, especially for wetlands loss, but expand that to where it covers the entire country, or at least more of the country. And then finally, fully fund and strengthen the National Wetlands Inventory Program. This provides critical information for managing wetland habitats and their benefits. The ask right now is for funding at $10 million annually to update wetlands data in high priority regions where things are rapidly changing, where we are seeing a lot of development. There's a very good chance that, without the need for folks, developers, whomever, to get permits under the Clean Water Act, we're not even going to know what we're losing, because that was the only way that we knew what was being developed. Shifting to the EPA, there's a lot that the EPA can do. We'll try and talk about a little of it as quickly as we can. The first is increase funding and expand the scope of the wetland program development grants through guidance to support state and tribal wetland conservation programs. That's a lot of words to say that the EPA has funds available that are for states and tribes in the conservation programs that those states and tribes have. And so we need to ask EPA to not just increase the funding, provide more resources for that program, but expand the scope, similar to what we were talking about with Fish and Wildlife Service conservation easements, to really try and, get as many wetlands sort of under the blanket of some sort of restoration or conservation authority. And so this is just another way of coming at some of these wetlands. Secondly, allocate a portion of Inflation Reduction Act funding from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, Climate Pollution Reduction Grants, and Environmental and Climate Justice Block Grants to further climate objectives through wetland and stream conservation. Again, this audience is probably familiar, but wetlands are fantastic carbon sinks, and pound for pound are sort of one of the best ecosystems we have for fighting climate change, or at least mitigating climate change. And the IRA authorized billions of dollars in funding specifically through the EPA to support efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change through various programs. And so again, this is just asking the EPA to focus on these sort of powerhouse carbon sinks as a way to fight climate change with these available funds. And finally, advocate for the EPA to direct a funding allocation for Section 319 non-point source pollution reduction grants, specifically for wetland and stream restoration. The EPA offers these grants for non-point source pollution reduction. Again, this is an existing resource, and you see a lot of these grants for go into kind of agriculture heavy areas to reduce runoff and stuff like that. And that is a critical need as well. But, I think really focusing some of that funding on conservational wetlands would help not only backfill Sackett, but also, some of the goals that are already in place for things like reducing runoff. We know wetlands are fantastic for, kind of storing water and purifying it before releasing it downstream. Finally, the Army Corps of Engineers recommends specific changes to the nationwide Permit 27 text in consultation with the Corps to facilitate effective aquatic ecosystem restoration. So there are specific changes to the nationwide permit to, that would facilitate effective restoration. And so, these are permits that are available nationwide for things like restoration, but there are changes that we would like to see be made that would sort of better protect and help enhance restoration practices across the country. And the big one here is work to ensure that core civil works project studies, designs, and/or operations don't sever Clean Water Act jurisdiction of affected wetlands and other aquatic resources. So this is the callback to the first slide at the beginning where I was showing you the wetland that was not connected to the river. A lot of Army Corps projects are really good at putting some sort of barrier between a water body and an adjacent wetland, like a levee, or a dike or something like that. Under Sackett, once that levee goes in, once a road goes in, once a dike goes in, and physically separates a wetland from like a river, that wetland is no longer jurisdictionally covered by the Clean Water Act. And so working that the Corps is doing everything that they can in the projects that they're moving forward with to wherever possible not sever those connections, and so that those wetlands lose that jurisdictional status under the Clean Water Act is a huge priority. And finally, we get to some federal legislative priorities. It's not all just administrative. Ultimately, like I said, Congress is going to have to amend the Clean Water Act to clarify the protections that is on this list, but it's at the very bottom, and we'll get to that in a second. So the first thing is appropriations. The old adage, if you tell me what your priorities are, but show me your budget and I'll tell you what your priorities are, kind of stands out here. So we need to maintain and strategically increase discretionary funding for key federal wetlands conservation programs like NAWCA. You see that down on this list, and wetland program development grants. And so, again, just fighting for those appropriations to make sure that we are maximizing wherever we can up to the fully authorized amounts for wetlands conservation programs. Recovering America's Wildlife Act, supporting passage of RAWA would enhance Pittman-Robertson funding for state and tribal wildlife and conservation funds to increase resources for wetland and stream conservation as well as restoration, as well as other priorities identified in state wildlife action plans and other conservation planning efforts. Like we talked about, wetlands are pretty important habitat. So, when we start talking about protecting wildlife and habitat, wetlands are going to be on that list. EPA I mentioned NAWCA, North American Wetlands Conservation Act, in terms of appropriation. So, this is a grant funded program. This is a grant program that matches at least 2-to-1. With matching dollars from local sources to restore and conserve wetlands. The math actually works out that for a grant project to be competitive to receive a NAWCA grant, that match really does have to come in at really at least 3-to-1. But making sure that NAWCA is fully funded, and if we can increase that authorization would be great. EPA geographic programs like the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, the Chesapeake Bay program, all of these geographic programs have wetlands conservation components that are part of them. So we need to make sure that these geographic programs are strong, as well as look at where we can improve or provide greater access. So Representative McCollum's Mississippi River Restoration and Resilience Initiative Act is a good example of that, which is modeled after the highly successful Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And it would just do that for the states along the Mississippi River as well. And there would be a significant restoration component to that bill. Finally, we need to oppose efforts to weaken the Clean Water Act. Look, the act is pretty weak as it is right now, but that does not mean that there are not members of Congress who would like to see it weaker, and those need to be opposed. Kate is going to talk about the Farm Bill here in a little bit, so I won't say too much there, but that is a huge piece of legislation that has pretty important consequences for wetlands conservation on private lands. And then finally, the Clean Water Act of 2023. This is just the current Congress's version of this bill, but it would amend the Clean Water Act, as we talked about, to clarify that wetlands and tributary streams are indeed jurisdictional. So that's my rough rundown of some of the things that the League and our partners are doing to sort of backfill Sackett protections. But what are the things that you can do? This quote, everybody attributes it to Teddy, and if you read his autobiography, he actually attributes it to some guy in Virginia. So it wasn't Roosevelt that actually said it. Anyway, the things that you can do, the most important thing you can do is stay informed. know what is going on. And one of the easiest ways to do that is just to sign up for our clean water newsletters. If you haven't already done that, you can do that on our website. We've got a ton of newsletters. We've got clean water newsletters. We've got salt watch newsletters. We've got nitrate watch. We've got ag soil matters ag newsletters. And you can sign up for all of these at the league's website. And if you're reading those, you'll be in the loop. You'll know what's happening. And that's one of the most important things that you can do. And the other thing you can do is take action. You can sign up for league action alerts at the league's homepage. Advocacy goes beyond just doing action alerts, but they're a great first step if you're already doing that. And you would like to do more, and please reach out to us. Give me a call, shoot me an email, shoot Heather an email, and get in touch with us. And we are happy to find as many ways as we can possibly think of for you to take action to step up and conserve wetlands. And then talk about what you've learned. And so kind of, you can combine these last two bullets here, but it's important to talk about what you've learned with your friends and your neighbors. This is something that, I think a lot of people sort of gloss over, and it really is important because, we're all so heavily influenced by our peer groups. And, I think that if we talk about how big a deal this is, this loss of protections for wetlands and tributary streams, and what that means for our own health, for our drinking water, for our safety in terms of flood protection, and what it means for the fish and wildlife that we share this planet with, that has a bigger influence, I think, than it really gets a lot of credit for. And then sharing your stories. I think, that's sort of part of talking about what you've learned, but we have a very specific component that we would like for folks to do. And so what I've got here is a screenshot. Perhaps you've seen this, perhaps not. But on our website, there's a spot you can go to. You see the link up there, Water Regional Clean Water Act, and then you can share your water quality concerns. I'm sure that there have been multiple links for this that have gone out in these newsletters that we've asked you to subscribe to, and if not, I'm sure they will be soon. But you can use this to share your stories and your concerns with us at the league. And this is important because what you are seeing out there gives us context for everything that we do, everything that I just talked about, from talking to CEQ to talking to the Corps about making sure they're not severing connections, to talking to members of Congress about, don't weaken the Clean Water Act any further, or support a stronger Clean Water Act, or support NALCA. Everything that was in the first part of this presentation, the stories that we get from you and what you're seeing on the ground, they're what gives those conversations context. That's what gives us a reason to go talk to Senator so-and-so staff and say, hey, in your state, this is what people are seeing. They have seen declines. They've been monitoring for years. They've seen a decline since Sackett. Or even if they haven't seen declines, whatever your stories may be, we used to have more wetlands here, and now they're gone, and we don't see as many ducks as we used to. I am not here to tell you that your story is not important enough to share with us. I'm here to tell you the exact opposite of that. So please, please, please give us those stories so that we can provide the context to decision makers on why this is important. And that is all I've got. So I will stop there and turn it over. I don't know if we're kicking it to Kate or back to Heather, but I will hang up and listen.
Thank you so much, Jared. And we are just about to pass it off to Kate. I just wanted to pop on to first say thank you for that great overview. And also to remind everyone, or to point out, that I dropped the link for that page that Jared was just pointing out in the chat. So if you want to head there now, or when we're finished today, It's iwla.org/Clean Water Act is the short link, and you can share your clean water stories and concerns. So with that, we're going to pass it off to Kate Hansen, which she's the league's agriculture director, and she is going to speak about the Farm Bill, which is one example of very timely legislation that we can all be interacting with. So take it away, Kate.
Thanks, Heather. If that looks right, we'll go ahead and get started here. So Jared has set us up really nicely for this conversation about the Farm Bill. And as he said, this is sort of one of the levers that we have to put our energy towards and getting a good Farm Bill in the interest of water quality. And for the next few minutes, I kind of want to paint a picture for you all that this is a larger story about how ag practices impact our water quality. And on the particular topic of wetlands, we have some really important tools in the Farm Bill that we need to make sure stay strong in the next iteration of this process. I know we all are kind of coming to this call from different vantage points, but I think it bears repeating that the way our nation's farms and ranches are managed impacts us all. And sometimes they feel distant if we're in more of a metropolitan area or in a city, but the impacts to things like water quality are at the very top of that list. The way that fertilizer use and certain management practices are used on a farm will impact the runoff that we're seeing into the streams and the water, and ultimately impacting communities downstream in the quality of their drinking water. There are other examples like the practices that can help us fight climate change, practices that will help soil health develop in a positive way. And we know that that can be linked to higher nutritional value in our food. So it's really critical that we're focused on this, even if we're not actively farming or ranching. And when we look at the studies and we look at sort of the counts of what types of practice implementation we need to meet some of those goals, there are a lot of different numbers out there. But collectively, we see that we need more of those folks doing beneficial practices. So a little bit, my background is working with farmers and ranchers directly at times, and we know that they're running a business, right? And so with that in mind, it's how do we get them to sort of take these beneficial steps to improve their own land, to help us all? And that might come about in a few different ways. So one of those ways might be implementing a practice alongside regular production. So they're still raising livestock, they're still growing a crop, they still have their business going in that way, but they're implementing something or installing something alongside of that, like an edge of field practice. Relatedly, they might change their management style on some particular part of their operation. So an example of this is no-till, where a farmer would stop tillage on their operation, and that has great benefits for things like soil health and phosphorus. In a slightly different vein, they might do something like take area out of production, because there's a real benefit of doing that. And so that could be a buffer along a stream bank. In some cases, there's a wetland on a property that we need to protect or even sort of bring back to life. And then there are also things like voluntary easements that a landowner could enter into to protect that ground. So just to kind of give us a flavor of what some of these things look like on the landscape, one really sort of workhorse of these practices with a whole host of benefits is cover crops. So this is a practice where a farmer is planting a crop in the off season. They're not intending to harvest or make money off of that crop. It's just to protect that land and keep it covered. And that keeps the soil from going every which way, especially in rain events. It helps us keep fertilizer and nutrients on the field where they belong. And this is a photo of a cover crop that I took here in central Iowa. We've already talked a lot about wetlands, but they are also practices that we think about in the Farm Bill and in ag conservation programs. So there are programs, and I'll speak about them in a moment, that will help a landowner protect a wetland on their property. That might be sort of bringing it back where it was once gone. It might be making enhancements to the quality of that wetland. but these are critical again for our water quality concerns. Stream buffers, retiring a little bit of land just along a stream or a creek, seeding it down has great benefits to water quality. And another thing that we talk about a lot are what are called edge of field practices. These are pretty, not the most technically savvy, but pretty sophisticated in what they do. And they are essentially addressing water before it goes from the field to the waterway and making improvements on the quality of that water. And this is a photo of a gentleman in Polk County, Iowa, with a saturated buffer on his land. So these 4 examples, it's a much longer list, but these are some of our 4 really strong tools when we think about nitrogen. Reducing nitrogen runoff, which ultimately could turn into nitrate in our waterways and be a concern for human health. Phosphorus is another nutrient that we are concerned about in the water, and these are a few of the practices that come up when we talk about phosphorus. So again, cover crops are going to provide a great benefit. That no-till, where we're trying to reduce or eliminate tillage of the ground. Diverse crop rotations here in Iowa and much of the Midwest and other states as well. We've got rotations that look like corn, corn, corn every single year, or corn, beans, corn, beans. And so this is having a conversation about, could we implement a small grain as a part of that rotation, or could we diversify that system in some way? And there are sort of other interesting, some of these are more cutting edge practices that are helpful. One of them being prairie strips, where we actually seed down a strip of land within a production sort of system. And that has benefits, again, to phosphorus, to soil health, to slowing down that water. So there's a long list that a producer could choose from. And we really are in a position with our water quality concerns, as well as things like climate change, soil health degradation. We want to make sure that these are getting out onto the landscape. And don't just take my word for it. If we look at the plans and the watershed implementation strategies that states, communities, individual watersheds have stood up in the past few decades, these are the types of practices they're talking about. They're talking about wetlands, they're talking about cover crops, and they're monitoring how much progress they're making on implementing those strategies. And when we look at the numbers, even as recently as this year, we've gotten some new data on how these practices are going. We are making some progress if we talk about, for example, the number of acres of cover crops, but we're nowhere near where we need to be. And so this map is specifically about cover crops, showing the percentage of total cropland that's in a cover crop in 2022. And you'll see the regions, you know, the mid-Atlantic there is looking pretty strong, but the highest rung on that key is just 15% or more of total cropland in a cover crop. And so we need these practices to increase. So when we talk about the Farm Bill, there's a version of this where I could walk you through every single title. These are the 12 titles or sort of sections of the Farm Bill that we can work within. Title II, the conservation title, is really critical for our efforts. But what I think is more compelling is that the Farm Bill is the federal government's biggest investment in conservation on privately owned lands. This is, as Jared said, where we sort of put our money where our mouth is, and we try our best as a community to create programs that can help deploy these practices on privately owned land. And we know that the United States is privately owned, right? 60% of our ground is privately owned, and 52% of our ground is used for ag. So these are really significant parts of the country that the government cannot just determine, hey, this is how we're gonna do things here in the same way they could on publicly managed land. This is kind of a different chess game, and we've got to figure out how to work with our private landowners to move the needle. So a few sort of basics of what the Farm Bill is. We get a new Farm Bill roughly every 5 years. It's written by primarily the members of the agriculture committees in Congress. And our most recent farm bill was the 2018. It expired in September of last year, and soon after, Congress voted to extend it through September of this year. So if any alarms are going off in your head, you are correct, because that means we are really in active negotiation times right now for our next farm bill, and the clock is ticking, if you will, for them to get a new one written and passed. And sort of the bottom line is that this is the opportunity every 5 years that comes around for us to make investments, to improve existing programs. We might create new initiatives or promote sort of new ideas in the Farm Bill. But this comes around every 5 years, and it really is a meaningful time to engage if we care about these issues. As far as where we are right now in the process, we are coming off of, quite frankly, a few months of pretty limited progress. We know that the farm bills, there's a version in the House, a version in the Senate, as follows sort of the path in Congress. And they're pretty much written. There are still some debates that need to be hashed out. Some of them are not related to conservation, but will get caught up in some of those other 12 titles. But the sort of interesting thing that's happened just in the past few weeks is that the leader on the House side, which is Chairman G.T. Thompson of Pennsylvania, has said that he wants to get a draft out and marked up in committee by Memorial Day, which is basically the end of May. And so what this means is that we are in a critical few weeks to be talking about this. Right now, there's a message we can send of, we need to prioritize conservation. The Farm Bill needs to meet the moment on these critical issues. And there will be a day when we see a draft and a very short window to respond to that draft. And so if you are seeing things from the league in your inbox or action alerts, especially in May, it's likely that that's what's happening, is that we're responding to a really quick turnaround of, this is what they're proposing, and these are the details that we're kind of processing and responding to. So a couple of the provisions in that conservation title that we care a lot about are the programs that help those farmers, ranchers, landowners do these beneficial practices. It's a long list, but I have a few examples here of some of the flagship, sort of the big ones that we talk about. One of them is the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP. And this is basically for a producer that wants to implement a project or a single practice. It's pretty focused in that way. The contracts are a little bit shorter in length, just a couple of years. They don't have to be doing anything else prior. They can just sort of walk into their NRCS office, Natural Resources Conservation Service, apply, and if they're accepted, they're going to get some cost share, some financial help, and some technical help to get a new practice going. That might be something like cover crops. That might be something like terraces. But this is one of the big conservation programs we talk about. A similar, but with some key differences, program is the Conservation Stewardship Program, or CSP. And this takes a similar approach to EQIP, except that it looks at the entire operation over a 5-year period. So the landowner or farmer will sit down with NRCS. They will talk about what are the list of practices that they could do in the next 5 years to enhance conservation on their operation. And then that's how their contract looks. So they're actually doing a couple things all at once. A key part of this program is you do have to be doing a little bit of conservation to be eligible. And so it's not uncommon for somebody to be in EQIP and then maybe a couple years down the line start looking at CSP. But again, they're receiving financial cost share to make some of this happen, and then also technical assistance. When we say technical assistance, an example I like to use is rotational grazing. This is a practice where you're moving livestock. There are a host of benefits of doing that, but you're moving them among smaller paddocks in sort of a different way than you may have managed them previously. And so NRCS staff will sit down with you and kind of explain, how are we going to do that? What's the timeline we're thinking about? Just kind of help that happen when you are needing to change your management. The Conservation Reserve Program is also one of the big programs. This is through the USDA Farm Service Agency. And as I mentioned earlier, there's different ways to approach this. And CRP is more about removing environmentally sensitive land from production. And in exchange for that, there's a rental payment issue to the landowner because they could be making money off of a tenant being there. There are 3 types of CRP: general, grasslands, and continuous. And continuous is interesting in part because that is where we can see some wetland protection in CRP, and some other practices that we know have major water quality benefits, like filter strips, prairie strips. There's also a variety of wildlife practices as well. So as we're talking with folks about the Farm Bill, we want to make sure that continuous CRP stays strong, particularly because we know it has that wetlands potential. And the 4th program I will just run through quickly is ASEP, the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. This is, again, slightly different, but essentially this is a landowner entering into a voluntary legal agreement to protect their land and often to protect conservation value of their land. So there's ALE, which is the agricultural land side of the program, and then there's wetland reserve easements, which is another arm of the program, again, with power to protect wetlands in a totally voluntary, totally opt-in way for landowners. And through ASEP, it's not one of the types of ASEP, but there's also a wetland reserve enhancement partnership program, which brings in partners in the process. So these programs all sound well and great, get into your local office and sign up and that sounds lovely. And it is a great model. But what we find is that they're popular and they're underfunded. And so for years, we have been in a situation where there is more demand than what we can fund. There may be folks that are turned away because they're not eligible or something like that. And that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about truly people are being cut off because we simply don't have the funding to meet the demand for these programs. And as I said earlier, we're in a moment where we need to be encouraging and supporting folks that are excited about this and want to do these types of practices. And instead, we're in a position where we're turning people away, and that's frustrating to them. It's not good for the big picture. We all lose out when we're doing this. So this map is just showing us the percentage of EQIP applicants that were funded in 2023. And as you can see, some of those states are lower than 20% of their applicants were actually enrolled in the program due to limited funds. I think that example of Illinois I was looking at the other day, it was like 3,000 folks that had been turned away. And CSP, a similar story. We've got some states as low as, less than 10% folks being awarded contracts. Just briefly, I know that our purpose here today was to talk about the laws protecting clean water, and a lot of these provisions are more carrot than stick. We do have a little bit of stick in the Farm Bill as it relates to what we call conservation compliance. And so these are provisions that were set up in the 1985 Farm Bill. In the league's view, I think just sort of making that commitment between the taxpayers that are funding programs and the producers that they will not do certain things. And if they do these things, then they're not eligible for most farm programs like crop insurance and commodity programs. So they can't plant a commodity on highly erodible land without a conservation system. They can't plant a commodity on a converted wetland, which is a key protection for our wetlands. And they can't convert a wetland to make possible the production of a commodity. And so commonly these are called sod buster and swamp buster, and these are some of the tools that we have and we want to keep strong to protect these types of land. There's also a provision that's more closely related to crop insurance called Sod Saver in the Midwest Prairie Pothole region. And this basically says you can't break sod and just start farming it. And if you do, then we're going to reduce your subsidies on your crop insurance by 50% for 4 years. This is something the league has been on the record for considering making it all 50 states, not just in the Prairie Pothole region. But again, this is sort of on the book in the Farm Bill as one of the things we have, one of the tools. So the bottom line that we've been talking about a lot internally as well as externally is that Congress needs to pass a farm bill that meets this moment, one that is prioritizing water quality, soil health, and climate action. And so I'll echo a lot of the things that Jared said. Consider taking action alerts on our website, iwla.org. If you click this Take Action tab, these are really sort of manageable actions that you can take. We put work into crafting the messaging, and it usually ends up being an email or a call that you could make to your lawmaker to support provisions that are really important. So right now we've got one about the Farm Bill, just sort of in a general way, encouraging them to pass a good Farm Bill. And we've also got one about wetlands provisions in the Farm Bill. So like I said, if you go in there, you'll put your zip code and then it'll populate already some text for you and you can modify it if you'd like. Again, as Jared said, we've got plenty of updates to keep you informed, and I have to give a shameless plug specifically to our Soil Matters updates, which are agriculture related. So you can find that on our website as well to stay in the loop. And then using your voice in media, sending letters to your lawmakers. Really, this is kind of an all hands on deck moment and an all hands on deck process. And so the more that our lawmakers can hear from their constituents, the better. So in sum, pay attention to those action alerts. We've got a few up now. There will be more via email, and doing those really does matter. So take a few minutes if you can and complete them. Sign up for our updates. And I would say for anything else, including media, letters, or sort of just being on our short list when we have real advocacy needs, get in touch with me, get in touch with Jared, just so we know you're out there and care about these topics. And I assure you, we will have moments where we need to call on you. So please consider, just reaching out and letting us know that you're ready to advocate, because we certainly could use as many folks as we can get. So with that, I see I'm right on the hour, so I'll pass it back to you, Heather. Thanks so much.
Fantastic. Thank you both, Kate and Jared, for that fantastic overview. I think our goal with this talk was really just to give a framework and an understanding of all of these laws that exist to protect clean water, and then to connect people with what they can do. And I think you guys hit the nail on the head. Like Kate said, we are kind of right at the hour, but if folks have questions, I do encourage you to drop those in the Q&A, and we can take those real quick. As a reminder, we will be sharing the recording of this talk. So if you need to go back and revisit anything, I know we covered a lot. You can look for that in your inbox before the end of this week for sure. I also shared a link in the chat to the Soil Matters newsletter. That's the agriculture newsletter, so you can sign up for that. And then don't forget, if you want to visit iwla.org/Clean Water Act, that is the page where you can share your stories. I think we're very lucky to have people like Kate and Jared teasing through the just litany of different opportunities to protect clean water and all the legalese that exists, and they distill it and they make it so simple for us to take action. And I think sometimes it seems like something so simple can't possibly matter, right? But it does. So please consider signing up for action alerts, newsletters, and getting in touch. So I'm not seeing a whole lot of questions. but I see a lot of thank yous in the chat. So thank you again to Kate and Jared. And if folks do have questions after we sign off, you know how to find us. So please reach out. But with that, I think we might say goodbye. Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.